Let me be very clear. Iran has just blockaded all major oil routes from the Persian Gulf, and the United States economy is now staring directly into the face of collapse. This is not rhetoric. This is reality unfolding in real time. Stay with me as I walk you through exactly how we got here and why the consequences are far worse than most analysts are willing to admit. Because what we are witnessing represents nothing less than a fundamental rupture in the post-Cold War energy architecture that has underpinned American primacy for more than 3 decades. A rupture born not from sudden irrationality in Tehran, but from the accumulated weight of strategic choices made in Washington and Tel Aviv that ignored every historical warning sign about the perils of confronting a determined regional power at its geographic and doctrinal core. The Strait of Hormuz, that slender maritime corridor which under ordinary circumstances carries some 21 million barrels per day, roughly 20 to 25% of all seaborne oil and liquefied natural gas traded globally, has seen its traffic collapse to a trickle, with recent tracking data confirming fewer than 10 ships per day successfully completing the transit, a statistic that captures the sheer velocity with which Tehran has imposed its will, not merely upon the strait itself, but upon the entire lattice of export lanes, feeder routes, and secondary terminals stretching from the northern reaches of the Gulf to the approaches of the Arabian Sea. West Texas Intermediate crude has already exploded past $110 per barrel, with Brent crude tracking in near-perfect synchrony as traders price in the permanence of the disruption, while the most recent weekly data from the Energy Information Administration shows U.S. average gasoline prices climbing inexorably toward $4.30 and beyond per gallon, a threshold that does not simply register as another incremental burden at the pump, but instead signals the first unmistakable tremors of systemic economic strain now propagating through household budgets, commercial logistics networks, and the broader manufacturing base in ways that will prove impossible to isolate or contain within any single sector. This moment matters profoundly, precisely because it crystallizes the limits of conventional power projection when arrayed against an adversary that has spent 4 decades perfecting the art of asymmetric denial, at the precise point where global energy flows are most vulnerable, a lesson that echoes through the annals of great power competition, from the British control of the Suez Canal in the 19th century to the Japanese strike on Pearl Harbor that sought to neutralize American naval reach in the Pacific. Yet one that contemporary planners in the Situation Room appear to have absorbed only in the most superficial fashion. The immediate market panic we are observing, futures contracts swinging wildly, refining margins compressing, and the first visible signs of hoarding behavior emerging in diesel and jet fuel inventories, serves as the leading indicator of a larger unraveling, one in which the United States, despite its vaunted shale revolution and strategic petroleum reserves, finds itself exposed to the very transmission mechanisms that have historically turned regional energy disputes into global recessions, mechanisms that operate through price signals rather than physical shortages, and that therefore punish even net exporters when the benchmark itself becomes unmoored from fundamentals. I invite you to consider the deeper implications here. For what Tehran has achieved is not merely a tactical interruption, but a strategic redefinition of the correlation of forces in the Persian Gulf, one that compels us to revisit every assumption about deterrence, escalation dominance, and the sustainability of sanctions regimes that have formed the backbone of American policy toward Iran since the 1979 revolution. Having been inside the system, I can tell you this kind of miscalculation is exactly what I watched planners warn against for decades, a warning that grew more urgent with each iteration of the nuclear negotiations, each round of sanctions tightening, and each Israeli operation that sought to degrade Iranian capabilities without ever confronting the underlying reality that Tehran's survival doctrine is built upon the very choke point that now serves as its ultimate lever. The core thesis I wish to advance is straightforward yet freighted with consequence. Iran's blockade constitutes a masterful, calculated strategic masterstroke, one forged in the crucible of Washington's profound miscalculation in launching and then relentlessly escalating the conflict that ignited on February 28, 2026, when U.S. and Israeli strikes targeted Iranian territory in what was framed as a preemptive measure against nuclear advancement, but was in reality the latest manifestation of a containment strategy that has repeatedly underestimated the Islamic Republic's capacity for calibrated retaliation and protracted resistance. The background is by now familiar, yet merits careful restatement, because the sequence of events reveals the inexorable logic of blowback that has defined every major U.S. intervention in the Middle East since the Carter Doctrine first committed American forces to the defense of Gulf energy flows in 1980. Strikes on Tehran that February morning prompted an immediate Iranian closure of the strait, a move executed with a speed and coordination that surprised even those who had studied the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' contingency planning, followed by a brief interlude in which Tehran offered limited toll-based passage exclusively to nations it designated as friendly before the full enforcement we observe today locked the maritime arteries shut. The subsequent U.S. naval counter-blockade imposed on April 13, which turned back Iranian tankers attempting to exit the Gulf and sought to deny Tehran the revenues necessary to sustain its economy, has instead produced the dual blockade nightmare in which both sides absorb pain, yet only one occupies the decisive geographic position at the ultimate choke point, a position that allows Tehran to dictate the tempo of negotiations, while Washington struggles to maintain coalition cohesion under the weight of rising energy costs among its allies. Iran's economy has indeed been battered, its currency under sustained pressure, its domestic fuel distribution network strained, its population enduring the cumulative effects of sanctions layered upon sanctions. Yet what insiders have long recognized is that the Islamic Republic's resilience, cultivated through 2 generations of economic siege warfare and ideological self-reliance, permits it to sustain this standoff far longer than Washington's models, calibrated to shorter political timelines and domestic electoral cycles, ever anticipated. Early oil price spikes have already shaved 0.3 to 0.5 points off U.S. GDP growth projections for the current quarter, a figure that may appear modest until one layers it against the compounding effects of higher input costs across the industrial base, reduced real incomes for working households, and the fiscal drag that inevitably accompanies any sustained transfer of wealth from consumers to energy producers, both domestic and foreign. But if you think that's the full story, it is not, because the deeper currents now in motion extend far beyond immediate economic indicators into the realm of grand strategy, where the United States finds itself confronting the consequences of having treated the Strait of Hormuz as a permanent American asset rather than a contested space whose control could be seized by a sufficiently determined and prepared adversary. What comes next is where things take a serious turn, because any honest assessment of Iran's asymmetric dominance in the Gulf must begin with the recognition that reopening these routes through purely military means has become a proposition of nightmarish complexity for the U.S. Navy, one that exposes the gap between theoretical superiority in open ocean engagements and the brutal realities of confined water operations against an enemy that has spent years preparing the battle space for precisely this contingency. I have watched these games played from inside the Situation Room, and this one is playing out exactly as the skeptics predicted all along, with Tehran leveraging a mine-laying capacity estimated at between 2,000 and 6,000 deployable units, mines that can be laid rapidly from small craft, submarines, and even civilian vessels disguised as fishing dhows. combined with layered anti-ship missile batteries positioned along both shores of the narrowest point in the strait, a mere 21 miles wide at its most constricted passage, where Iranian forces exercise effective control over the entire transit corridor. Drone swarms, now a proven element of Iranian doctrine following their deployment in the 2019 attacks on Saudi oil facilities and the more recent coordination with Houthi forces in the Red Sea, add a dimension of low-cost, high-volume saturation that can overwhelm even the most sophisticated Aegis-equipped destroyers and carrier strike groups, while fast attack boat tactics refined through decades of exercises in the same waters allow the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy to conduct hit-and-run operations that exploit the vulnerability of large warships in restricted channels, where maneuver room is measured in hundreds of meters rather than miles. Pre-war daily traffic through these waters, which routinely saw between 125 and 140 ships of all types making the transit, has now been reduced to single digits, a collapse that reflects not only the physical closure, but the psychological deterrent effect of Iranian statements and demonstrated capabilities that have caused commercial operators to reroute or simply remain in port rather than risk their vessels and crews. The logistical impossibility of a quick U.S. clearance operation becomes apparent the moment one examines the operational requirements for mine countermeasures in such an environment. The shallow waters, the high volume of commercial traffic that must be protected or diverted, the constant threat of missile and drone attack from shore-based batteries that can be reconstituted faster than they can be degraded, and the absence of any secure forward operating base on the Iranian littoral itself. Current Pentagon estimates now stretch to a minimum of 6 months for even a partial reopening under permissive conditions, a timeline that does not incorporate the real-time harassment, the political constraints on escalation, or the economic bleed that will continue unabated while clearance proceeds at a deliberate pace dictated by the need to minimize casualties and avoid broader war. Trump's blockade strategy, conceived as a means of squeezing Tehran into submission by denying it the very sea lanes it now controls so effectively, has backfired spectacularly. Because while it does impose revenue losses on Iranian hydrocarbon exports, it simultaneously drives global energy prices higher in ways that harm American allies, neutrals, and even domestic consumers far more than they isolate the Islamic Republic, which retains leverage through selective enforcement and its extensive network of proxy relationships that can extend disruption into secondary theaters. The global supply shock we are already experiencing effectively removes between 15 and 18 million barrels per day from available markets, a volume that dwarfs the disruptions of 1973 or 1979, and that has already begun to ripple into U.S. manufacturing and agriculture through higher diesel costs for trucking and farm equipment, elevated feedstock prices for petrochemicals, and the secondary effects on fertilizer production that threaten the next harvest cycle in ways that will manifest as food price inflation long before the political system can formulate a coherent response. The math is brutal, and it is this math that now governs the strategic calculus in ways that no amount of rhetorical resolve can alter. This next part changes everything, because the cascading economic dominoes now striking the United States must be understood not as isolated price spikes, but as a systemic transmission process that operates through global commodity markets, financial derivatives, and the real economy simultaneously, exposing the limits of shale-era self-sufficiency when the benchmark price itself becomes the primary vector of pain. Despite America's emergence as a net oil exporter in recent years, the integrated nature of world energy markets means that a sustained 20% global supply disruption historically correlates with crude prices climbing into the $120 to $150 range per barrel and GDP contractions of between 1.5 and 3% in major importing economies. patterns documented across multiple episodes from the first oil shock through the 2008 financial crisis, when energy prices amplified the housing collapse. We are already witnessing a documented U.S. gasoline price increase of 50 to 60 cents per gallon in the short interval since enforcement tightened, with econometric models now projecting another dollar or more per gallon if the blockade remains unresolved. Increases that translate directly into reduced discretionary spending for the median household, compressed margins for transportation-dependent industries, and a measurable drag on corporate earnings that has already erased recent stock market gains and is flashing early recession signals across credit markets and leading indicators. Dallas Fed-style simulations, which model the second and third order effects of energy price shocks on regional economies, show a 2.9 percentage point annualized hit to GDP growth in a single quarter under conditions of prolonged closure, a figure that compounds when one factors in the Federal Reserve's constrained policy space. With inflation already re-accelerating due to the energy component, the central bank faces the classic stagflationary dilemma, in which raising rates to combat price pressures risks deepening the downturn, while holding steady allows expectations to become unanchored. Iran's strategic patience stands in stark contrast, a posture honed through years of absorbing sanctions and adapting to blockade-like pressures, while forcing the international community to negotiate on Tehran's timeline rather than Washington's. A patience that manifests in the Islamic Republic's ability to reroute limited volumes of its own exports via overland pipelines to friendly neighbors, or through selective maritime channels granted exclusively to China, India, and other non-adversarial powers, thereby denying equivalent flexibility to the United States and its coalition partners, while maintaining just enough revenue to sustain domestic stability and proxy operations. Wall Street volatility has already erased billions in market capitalization and is threatening broader recession signals through widening credit spreads, inverted yield curves in key sectors, and the first signs of stress in regional banks exposed to commercial real estate and energy lending. Patterns that will intensify if summer driving season unfolds under sustained high prices and political pressure mounts for some form of intervention that carries its own escalation risks. But if you think that's the full story, it is not. This next part changes everything, because the deepest strategic truth emerging from this crisis is that Washington and Tel Aviv fundamentally underestimated Iran's willingness and capability to weaponize the strait indefinitely, transforming America's own profound economic interdependence on stable Gulf energy flows into a self-inflicted wound that now dictates the terms of engagement rather than the reverse. Let me be very clear. The miscalculation here runs far deeper than most realize, extending beyond mere tactical oversight into a structural failure to internalize the lessons of asymmetric warfare that Iran has mastered since the tanker war of the 1980s. The proxy campaigns that have reshaped the Levant and the Arabian Peninsula without ever requiring conventional fleet engagements, and the nuclear program itself, which has served as both a deterrent and a bargaining chip in ways that have consistently outmaneuvered successive U.S. administrations. Iran is now dictating terms from a position of genuine strength, with the blockade serving as leverage not merely for sanctions relief, but for broader regional dominance that includes consolidated influence over the Iraqi government, deepened ties with Syria and Lebanon through Hezbollah, and a strategic partnership with Russia and China that provides diplomatic cover and economic lifelines at the United Nations and in energy markets. This leverage has already manifested in Tehran's demonstrated selective passage policy, under which tankers bound for China and India have been permitted to proceed, while those linked to adversarial interests have been turned back or subjected to harassment, a calibrated approach that isolates Washington diplomatically, even as it attempts to cobble together coalitions for reopening the lanes. Coalitions that have so far stalled in the face of Allied reluctance to commit naval assets to what many European and Asian capitals view as an unwinnable quagmire with uncertain exit ramps. The projected 6-month clearance timeline, once dismissed as a pessimistic outlier in Pentagon war games, now aligns with independent models showing a 75% or higher probability of global recession if the disruption extends beyond 30 days, a threshold that is rapidly approaching, and that carries with it the prospect of political upheaval in multiple capitals as publics demand relief from energy costs that no amount of domestic production can fully offset. The revelation that Iran's pre-war preparations, stockpiled mines in the hundreds of thousands, missile systems upgraded with improved seekers and decoys, hardened coastal defenses integrated with drone surveillance networks, and command and control redundancies that have survived initial strikes, render this blockade far more sustainable than any pre-conflict assessment allowed for, only underscores how profoundly the intelligence and strategic communities misread Tehran's threshold for pain and its capacity for endurance, a misreading that echoes the intelligence failures preceding the 1979 revolution itself, and that now exacts its price in real time. I have watched these games played from inside the Situation Room, and the end game here is now crystal clear. Iran holds the strategic high ground in ways that force the United States into a genuine lose-lose choice between prolonged economic pain that could extend well into the summer driving season and beyond, accelerating inflation, eroding real wages, and generating unavoidable political fallout in an election cycle already strained by domestic divisions, or the prospect of humiliating concessions that would validate Tehran's playbook and reshape Middle East power dynamics for the next generation in ways that diminish American influence across the region. Historical parallels to the 1973 and 1979 oil shocks remind us that sustained prices above $100 per barrel in real terms have consistently ushered in measurable U.S. recessions, complete with the attendant rises in unemployment, drops in industrial output, and shifts in voter sentiment that no amount of rhetorical framing can fully mitigate. Patterns that will be amplified this time by the higher baseline of global debt, the fragility of post-pandemic supply chains, and the political polarization that makes coherent policy responses more difficult to formulate and sustain. Iran's demonstrated survival through 2 full months of this dual blockade environment proves the depth of its asymmetric resilience, built on domestic substitution strategies, alliances with non-Western powers that provide alternative markets and financing, and a doctrine that prioritizes denial over direct confrontation, a doctrine that has allowed Tehran to impose costs on its adversaries while absorbing its own losses without crossing the threshold into open conventional war. The outlook includes 50 to 60% odds of a full U.S. recession if the situation remains unresolved by the third quarter, with global growth projections already being shaved by 2 to 3 percentage points in the most sober assessments from institutions that rarely sound the alarm this early, and the probable near-term scenarios now crystallizing into 3 broad pathways. Continued high prices into summer that drive inflation and political fallout, with midterm or special election pressures forcing some form of de-escalation. A negotiated settlement on Iranian terms that provides sanctions relief and tacit recognition of Tehran's regional role in exchange for a phased reopening. Or further escalation that only deepens the crisis, whether through direct U.S. strikes on Iranian mine-laying and missile infrastructure, or Iranian responses that extend disruption into the Red Sea and beyond through Houthi coordination. Stay with me. The outlook is sobering but predictable, because what we are witnessing is not merely a temporary energy crisis, but a long-term shift in the geopolitical architecture of the Persian Gulf, where the era of unchallenged American naval dominance at the choke points gives way to a more contested reality in which regional actors like Iran can impose costs that ripple outward to affect even the most insulated economies, compelling policymakers in Washington to confront the limits of power projection when economic interdependence becomes the ultimate weapon, and when the adversary has prepared the battlefield with a patience and foresight that have consistently outlasted American political attention spans. If you want the real story, the one they won't tell you on the networks, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join us for the next update. Because what happens in the Strait of Hormuz in the coming days will reshape the global economy for years to come. This is Lawrence Wilkerson. Stay informed, stay ahead.